In today's tutorial, we'll be painting these super sweet, semi-realistic bumblebees using easy, approachable watercolor techniques. I recently painted these guys for a new greeting card in my shop, and I had so many DMs on Instagram asking for a tutorial, so here it is. Grab your supplies and let's get started. Before we begin, all the supplies like the paint, paper, and brushes I'm using throughout this video are linked down below in the description box. One thing I want to point out before we start painting is just how important color values will be in this tutorial. Now, if you don't know already, color value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. So for example, this here is a light value. You can see there's lots of water in my mixture. And this is a dark value. It's a lot more concentrated. So take a look at the difference between these bees. This one here looks dull and flat because all of the values of yellow and black are pretty much the same. There's not a huge shift between light and dark. Now these bees, on the other hand, these are the ones I painted for my greeting card, they look a lot more lifelike and 3D. That's because we have light values here showing the highlights of the bee's body, and then these dark values for the shadows. So having that variety helps it look like the body is curved or 3D like it is in real life. So that's just something I wanted to emphasize before we start painting. Please, please, please try to focus on utilizing a range of values as you paint. It's always best to start lighter than you think you need and then go darker and darker only on those deep shadow areas. Okay, so let's get started with our first bee. We're gonna paint 2 bees in total. Now, these are fairly simple in terms of the sketch, but I will put my sketch outlines up here on the screen for you if you'd like to pause the video and sketch these out onto your own paper. So I'm gonna be using 2 different brushes here. They're actually the same exact brush. It's the size 5 round brush from Princeton Velvet Touch, but sometimes it does help, especially in paintings like this, to use 2 different brushes because the colors are so different and I don't want my light yellows to get too muddied with my black. So one of the brushes will be for my yellowy orange mixture and the other will be for black. So remember what I said about values. We want to start way lighter than you think you need. So I'm mixing up my warm yellow mixture, but it is super, super faint. It's pretty much all water with just a hint of color. And just go ahead and place a very light layer of yellow on the yellow sections. The nice thing about painting bees like this is we're going to be using a lot of wet on wet and letting the colors bleed and blend. So your strokes do not have to be perfect. They don't have to stay perfectly within your lines, but we just want to start blocking in that color. So it's probably hard to even see on screen here because that's how light my yellow is. But it's a nice even layer of water. I don't want it too wet where there's huge puddles, but I also don't want it too dry because we do want to be able to layer color on top of this and let the colors bleed. Now I'm going to go back into my mixture and get a slightly darker value of yellow, and we're going to start adding in some of these shadows. So as I said, in my example paintings here, we have the light highlights, and then the edges of the bee's body get darker and darker to show that depth and that curve to the shape. So that's where we want to focus our darker shadows. So I have my slightly darker yellow here, and I'm just very gently tapping it on the outer edges of those 2 yellow sections. Another technique that'll be helpful during this is lifting. So lifting just means lifting some pigment off your page. So if there's ever a section that's a little too dark, just dry off your brush and lift some of that color off. So that's another really helpful way to be able to add highlights. So again, just going in and tapping in that darker yellow just on the very edge. Now while these are still wet, I'm switching to my other brush and I'm using carbon black for my shades of black. And same thing as we did with the yellow, I'm starting with just a very light value. So again, you can barely see that gray, and that's exactly how I want it to be, just super light, and that will give us enough space to start adding in the darker layers just on those shadow areas. One of the best parts of painting bees like this is getting that really fuzzy, furry effect. And we're going to be doing that by letting these 2 colors kind of softly bleed together. We don't want it to just turn into one giant mess of black and yellow. That wouldn't look very good. But we do want to have gentle bleeding between colors to generate that fuzzy effect. So you do have to work kind of quickly and manage your time well as you paint this because we want this whole painting to stay wet. as we go so that, first of all, we can tap in these soft layers of the darker shadows, and also so that when we go and add the black, it can kind of have that gentle bleeding between the black and the yellow. But for now, all I'm focusing on is adding in those shadows and kind of starting to build out the form of this bee. So you can already see, we've barely put any color down, but you can already see a bit of that 3D effect starting to take shape. So I'm just kind of working my way back and forth here, adding in darker values on both the yellow sections and the black sections. So you can see here that yellow has kind of bled into the black. Perfectly fine. You do want to exercise a little bit of control. As I said, you don't want the entire thing to bleed and blend together, but a little bit of bleeding is what creates that really fun, fuzzy bumblebee effect. So don't be too hard on yourself if you find this process difficult. It does just take a little bit of practice and understanding your paper and the wetness level of your layers, but that's the nice thing about paintings like this is there's not one perfect way to do it, and not all bees are going to look the same. So just take your time, have fun, focus on your water control, and I'm probably just going to do 1 or 2 more layers on each of these, and then we can start adding the details. So again, each time I'm going in, I'm getting slightly darker. So using a darker value, I have less water in my mixture. And the darker I go, the more I'm just staying on the very outer edges. We want that blend, that gradient from super light in the middle to darker, darker, darker on the edges. And I'll do another round of black as well. And this is the wet on wet technique again, so you can see every time I tap in a darker color, it's kind of blending and bleeding out on its own. So it does a lot of the work for you, which is really nice. Now for my final layer of shadows on the yellow parts, I'm actually going to go in with a warm brown. And I want to be very careful as I add this because obviously I want my bee to be yellow, and that warm yellow shade that we've been using is really beautiful, but I do want to accentuate those deep shadows on the very outer edges. So that's where I'm placing this color, is just on the very outer edges. And that creates a really beautiful contrast, and it really just drives in that 3D effect. So as I'm doing this, as I'm working my way towards those outer edges, I'm letting the tip of my brush create some little fuzzy texture on the very outer edges. So I'm just tapping it down, but the tip of my brush is creating those little tiny lines that almost look like fur or little fuzzy hairs on this bee. So just tapping it down, we don't need perfectly clean edges. We want a little bit of that texture. And that's what you get when you just let the tip of your brush kind of tap down on the page. So let's go ahead and add 1 more layer of black. This time we want it to be the darkest, so I'm going in with a really dark value. And I'm going to do the same thing, adding in those shadows on the very edges. Now, if you notice any of your layers have already started to dry, you can always re-wet it with some clean water. Again, on these 2 sections where they kind of overlap, I'm being really careful to not overdo it, but you can see that gentle blend. That's exactly what I want. And again, just tapping my brush down on the outer edges to get that really fun texture. Let's do that for this section up here as well. Now this process is really going to vary based on your painting. So maybe you are using different paper and it's drying differently than mine is. Maybe you started with a value that's a little bit darker than I did, so you won't have to use as many layers. But in general, we want to start light in those center areas and then build out the shadows darker and darker towards the edges. So I'm just doing this final layer. You can see I'm not getting any blending here, so I'm going to go ahead and rinse off my brush and just apply a clean layer of moisture here to re-wet it, because I still want to be able to get those blooms of color. And if it's fully dry, then you're going to get harsh, clean edges, which is what I want in a lot of my paintings, but not in this one. In this one, I really want those fuzzy edges that will help make our bees look cute and fuzzy and furry. So just kind of using my artistic intuition here. I don't want to go overboard, but I do want to make sure that our little guy has lots of great fuzzy texture. So again, I'm not pulling out and creating every individual little piece of fur or fuzz. I'm just tapping my brush down, and that's what's creating this nice texture. So I'm just tapping it down and letting the tip of my brush create these organic shapes. So that's kind of the last step I like to do on the body part, is just tap it down, make sure I have lots of great texture. And I'm gonna call it good for now on the main body of this bee. I am seeing a lot of good highlights where those lighter values are, and then darker shadows on the outside, so I feel like the form is looking good. I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry, and then we can add some more details. Once everything's nice and dry, I'm gonna go ahead and do the wings next, and I'm using just a very light shade of my carbon black. It's the same black that I used for the bee's body, but just super watered down. If you have a different shade of gray or a gray mixture that you like to use, that's totally fine. And for these wings, I don't have a precise way that I do them, but some things that I like to keep in mind is I wanna have natural organic strokes. I wanna keep a light hand so that nothing's too thick or heavy. And I want to leave some white space. So I'm going to start by laying down just an outline of the wing, and you can see how light that value is, again, because it is so watered down. So starting by just outlining it, and then I'm just going to create some wispy little strokes within that wing and leave some white space as well. The actual wings of bumblebees like this are so incredibly intricate and detailed, but we don't need to add in all of those little details. We just want to imply that they're delicate and dainty and detailed. We know that, but we don't need to actually go overboard on details here. This is a semi-realistic painting, so just implying those details is good enough for me. So you can see I'm leaving some white space here and just using the tip of my brush to create a unique little wing design. So see how there's some white spaces and some dainty lines. That's all I'm going to do, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So feel free to make these wings your own. Again, this is not a perfectly realistic bumblebee wing. I'm just kind of winging it, you could say, and just creating these delicate little lines. I'd say the more important thing here when you're creating these wings is to leave that white space. You don't want the wings to turn into a big blob of gray. You want it to look delicate and dainty, and that white space is really what helps make that happen. Once you're done with the wings, the last step is adding all the little details. So the antennas, the little legs, and the stinger. And I'm just going to use a very dark value of my carbon black here. I want to keep these little details very simple and straightforward. I don't want them to detract from the main bee's body or the wings. These last little details will be very simple and straightforward. So I mixed up my dark carbon black. I'm going to start with the antennas, using just the very tip of my brush to create these. Again, I want these to be dainty, light, delicate, and non-distracting. So I'm keeping a very light hand and only using the tip of my brush so that all of my lines for these details are thin and dainty. So let's start with the left antenna, using the tip of my brush and pulling it out a bit, and then pushing down and creating a little oval shape at the end. So keep a light hand, don't apply too much pressure. And there you go. Simple as that. Let's move on to the legs. I have 2 on each side. I'll show you on my example here. They start a little bit thicker towards the body, and then they get thinner towards the edge of the feet. And same thing for the stinger. So thicker and then thinner and coming to a point at the bottom. Using the tip of my brush and a dark black value, applying more pressure to get the stroke a little bit thicker as it meets the body, and just gently connecting it there. You can also tap your brush down a little bit to get that texture. I don't just want a perfectly clean line connecting it to the body. That wouldn't look very realistic. I don't want anything to look disjointed. So starting with the tip, applying a little bit more pressure, and then tapping it down to create a little bit of texture as it connects. And go ahead and do the same thing on the right side. And the last step to finish our cute little bumblebee is to add the stinger. So it's actually going to look very similar to how we did the legs. I'm going to start very light and dainty and then get thicker as it meets the body. Again, I don't want anything to look disjointed, so you can always just add some more texture there so that it blends in well with the rest of the body. And there is our first bee. So if you found this process a little bit tricky, I totally get it. It can be hard to master your water control and add those layers without it getting too messy, but just take your time, and we're gonna paint bee number 2 in a very similar way, but just in a different position. So you'll get more practice coming up next. And I just want to point out again, this bee that we just painted together looks so much more lively and 3D than this bad example that I did before the tutorial, solely because we have varying values. So again, we have these highlights, we have the shadows, we have different tones, tonal values of the yellows and the black. Whereas this one that looks dull and flat and just doesn't really look very lifelike is all one value. So there's no variation in the yellows, there's no variation in the black. So it just helps sometimes to see side by side the differences that you're making and the difference that a range of tonal values provides to your final painting. So keep that in mind as we do bee number 2. So I'll put the sketch up on the screen again if you want to pause the video and sketch it out onto your paper, but it's just this cute little hovering side view of the bumblebee, but the process will be pretty much the same. So again, I'm going to start with the light value of my yellow, and I'm going to go ahead and place that first layer down just in the yellow sections. So it's this section that is second to the right, making sure it's nice and even. And then the second section just to the left of his little head. So again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to have some intentional bleeding of colors later on once we add the black, but for now, I'm just making sure it's a nice even layer of my very light yellow. While it's still wet, I'm grabbing a darker value and starting to tap that in on the edges. I want that same light highlight in the middle and the darker value for the shadows along the edges. So you can see I'm just gently tapping those in. It's a slightly darker value and just putting them right on the very edge. So I'm using careful strokes. I'm not using too much water when I add these. If you use too much water when you add these additional layers, it's just going to flood the whole surface. And again, we want to maintain that light area in the middle for the highlight. So just be mindful of the amount of water and pigment you're using. You'll see my brush kind of going in and out of the frame. Sometimes I'll just use damp bristles to kind of smooth things out. But you're just starting to block in where those shadows are going to be. And now we can start to add in the black sections. So once again, it's going to be a pretty light value of gray. And I'm just putting an even layer down. And just like we did in the last one, you want a little bit of that color to bleed with the yellow, but not an overwhelming amount. You still want the yellow to remain yellow, but the little bit of fuzziness and bleeding between the two gives it that really fuzzy texture that we want to see. So using a light hand, especially in those areas where the yellow meets the black, I just am barely grazing it so that it blends together really gracefully. Keeping a light hand and just making sure that layer is nice and even. Let's go back in with some of the darker black and start blocking in those shadows. So once again, tapping it on top. This is the wet on wet technique because the surface is already wet from our first layer and we're putting wet paint on top. So using careful strokes here and just adding the shadows on the edges. Gently tapping it in, leaving some of the areas pretty light, and then gently tapping it where it meets the yellow. Now here's a little trick I can show you. So remember how we talked about lifting in the last little section? That's a little bit too much bleeding of the gray into the yellow for my liking. So I'm cleaning off my brush using damp bristles and just running it along to lift some of that color up. And that just brings back a little bit of that vibrancy of the yellow because too much of the black seeped in there. So I'm just going to tap back in some more yellow, and I'll do the same thing with this section. So that's actually a good example here to show you how you can fix little mistakes like that, is just by utilizing the lifting technique. You want to make sure you lift any color while it's still wet. It's a lot easier to do than if it has already dried. So this whole project is really a great lesson on time management, water control, all the techniques that are essential to watercolor, because as you see, I'm moving between sections, I'm using different colors, I'm picking up pigment where it's a little too dark, I'm tapping in shadows while it's still wet. So doing projects like this is really great for just building up your artistic intuition and your confidence as an artist, and just really getting the hang of working with your painting as it is. So just continue adding in these shadows on the edges, working between the black and the yellow, and just building up this depth and dimension. Because again, we want to avoid our bees looking too flat and boring. We don't want any of that. We want our bees to look lively and cute and 3D. I'm going to grab a little bit more of my cadmium yellow deep and just tap in that orange shadow along the edges while maintaining the light area in the middle. So when I'm adding shadows like this, I never really add additional color to the center of each of these sections. I'm just adding it to the outer edges. And again, I don't want a repeat of what happened with too much of the black seeping into the yellow. So every time I add black onto my brush, I'm tapping it on my paper towel to just make sure I'm not overdoing it. And just as we did on the last one, I'm going in with one final layer of my light warm brown to just deepen those shadows on the very edge of each of the yellow sections. So this is where I want to be really careful. I don't want my yellow sections to turn brown completely. I just want that little hint of depth with that darkest shadow. Now remember, when you get to this stage, when you're adding your last final bits of the shadow, you want to make sure you get that texture. See this texture from the first bee? That gives that kind of fuzzy, hairy look. You do that by just tapping your brush down. So see how the very tip of my brush, I'm just tapping, 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 so that you get that fuzzy look on the very outer edges of this bee. I'm going to do it for the yellow, and I'm going to do it for the black. So just gently tapping it, getting that nice textured look, and I'll do the same thing for the black, letting the tip of my brush create those organic looking strokes. So just kind of haphazardly tapping it down, getting that beautiful texture on this bee. At this stage, I'm happy with how the body of this bee is looking, so I'm going to move on to the wings. I'm going to do it the same way I did it on the first one, using a very light value of my black to where it's pretty much just a light gray, and just creating these really dainty lines. Now, if your bee still needs some more texture and more depth, feel free to add more layers if you want. Again, if you need to use the lifting technique to create stronger highlights, you always have the option to do that as well. And then when you're ready, you can join me in painting the wings. So once again, using the tip of my brush, I'm going to start by outlining this wing, not putting a whole lot of pressure down, but just gently lining it, and doing the same on the wing behind it. Now this one looks a lot smaller because it's further down the bee's body. So from this perspective, this wing on the right is behind the one on the left. And then I'm just going to create my little design. I don't have this pre-planned, I just kind of make my own little design here. Nothing too crazy. Now once again, we can add the finishing touches. So I'm going to start with the antennas, doing a very dainty line, curving down a bit, and then pushing down to create a little oval. And then a shorter one right next to it, using the same process. Let's add the little stinger on the bottom. So same as the last one, I start really thin for the very edge and then get a little bit thicker as it connects with the rest of the bee. And then you can do your legs however you want. I believe bumblebees actually have 6 legs, so on the first one we can just pretend that the other 2 are hovering down below the body that we can't see, but I'm gonna paint 6 of them here. So I'll have 2 little guys in the back. And then I'll just have 4 other ones kind of overlapping. I don't really have this planned out. You can really paint them however you like, but I just like the overlapping look a little bit. And I'll have one coming just in between the other 3. So I really like the look of that. It looks very natural, like if you actually see a bee flying around or buzzing around in the garden, they often have their legs just kind of flailing about. So I like the overlapping look there, and really pleased with how both of these turned out. So that is it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned some new techniques. And now that you have the process down, you can make any type of bee you'd like and add your own creative flair. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for future tutorials, please be sure to let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.